Good afternoon. We're going to get underway promptly here because I know many of our faculty and students have 1 o'clock classes to get to. But let's begin by acknowledging the land on which Chicago sits. We acknowledge this land, which was once occupied and revered by the Council of the Three Fires, comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. We thank those early inhabitants of Chicago for the way they revered this generous land. And let us here also remember all the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In particular, we remember our Lakota friends in South Dakota with whom CTU has had a strong bond for almost 40 years.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union, and we are delighted to welcome you to what is the inaugural event featuring our new fellow at CTU, the Joseph Cardinal Bernardin Fellow in Catholic Leadership at CTU, Father Dennis Holtschneider of the Congregation of Mission. Most of you do not need an introduction to Father Dennis. He was longtime president of DePaul University from 2004 to 2017. He has held many positions of leadership in the church and in academia. His most recent position was as the president of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. When he completed his service there, we could not have been more delighted when he accepted the invitation from CTU to become a senior fellow here, where his expertise in areas of academic administration and how they intersect with theology and church leadership are such a gift to us, to our students, to our faculty, as he serves as a resource person to us. We were pleased to give him the Diaconia Award in 2017, and we have had a long-term friendship with him. He was president of DePaul when CTU forged and formalized our academic alliance with DePaul University in the fall of 2011. And so this inaugural event is the first of very many that we hope you will join us for. We have respondents to Father Dennis, but I'm going to ask Steve Millies to return to the podium to introduce more fully today's event and all of our speakers. Thank you and welcome to all who are both physically present here in the room and to those of you who are with us online. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. And indeed, welcome to everyone who's joining us here in the room and online. My name is Steve Millies, and I am a member of the faculty and director of the Bernardin Center here at CTU. Just a couple of quick words of reminder, one for everyone. At the end of our presentation today, we will have time for a Q&A. We want to encourage you to be thinking about questions and entering into the dialogue with our speakers today as the program goes on. Second, and with apologies to the people who are joining us online, I do want to say to the folks in the room that we do invite you to participate also in enjoying some of the food and drink that we've got at the back of the room. Don't be bashful about getting up and taking some. We all understand this is the break between your morning and afternoon classes. We are so happy that you've joined us today as we welcome the Cardinal Joseph Bernardin Fellow in Catholic Leadership to our community here at CTU. Of course, as a member of the Congregation of the Mission, in another sense, he's only taking his place here among the many missionaries who call CTU home. You've already heard much about his biographical background. I will only delay his presentation so long as to say that we're very grateful he's chosen CTU as a place to spend some time and to enter into an even deeper relationship with us. Now, please let Father Dennis Holtschneider know how grateful we are and how welcome he is at CTU as he begins his remarks, leading a Catholic organization with and for LGBTQ plus populations.
Well, good afternoon. It's an honor to be part of CTU, to tell you the truth. It's an organization that's long respected for its preparation of the next generation of lay and religious pastoral ministers. And so it's an honor, too, to have been invited to deliver these thoughts today. One does not get to pick one's moment in history. The issues of the day are the issues of the day. For many of us, for many of us who are presently in church ministry, that means that we will engage the decision of the LGBTQ community to no longer hide in the shadows, but to emerge and to demand full incorporation and respect within society of which they are a part. The challenge is to do so in a society and in a church which are not of one mind on the issues attendant to the LGBTQ community's participation. For me, it was also a question of doing so when my inner convictions did not always align perfectly with official church teaching. And so please, I want you to understand today that I am not speaking for or on behalf of the Catholic Church. I'll be speaking about the church today, but it's not my purpose to represent or to defend or to explain the church. Sharing my own experience is more than enough for the hour that we have. What's important to understand is that I am a longtime university administrator, where controversial matters eventually and inescapably landed on my desk for direction. It turns out that Truman's desk sign about the buck stopping here had some truth to it. I'm also a priest, and that means that my pastoral instinct is to wonder what the person sitting in front of me most needs as a fully realized human being, especially spiritually. And it was in those venues that the issues facing my lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and non-binary brothers and sisters received my attention over the past few decades. At DePaul and at the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, where I spent much of my ministry, these questions emerged on matters of how these topics would be treated in the curriculum, how students would be accommodated in the dorms, what types of social and athletic opportunities would be supported for them, how health and counseling services would be provided, whether LGBTQ plus individuals would be hired onto the faculty and senior leadership positions, plays that the theater school might perform, whether the alumni's marriages or other partnerships would be celebrated and acknowledged, what names and pronouns would be honored, and of course, the provision and use of bathrooms. As these issues presented themselves over the years and repeatedly, I found it helpful to read on the issue in order to respond effectively. I needed to know church teaching, but also the scholarship of various fields. Over time, several observations and then principles came to ground my approach. First, I accepted that the disciplines of biology, history, sociology, and anthropology had sufficiently demonstrated that LGBTQ identities were variants within human nature. They were small percentages, to be sure, of the human community, but the evidence was clear. They had been present in the breadth of the human communities over millennia. Nor was there any basis for the suggestion that this was a free decision by an individual. Clearly, this was an aspect of one's humanity that one discovers and names over time. Earlier suggestions to the contrary had convincingly been set aside by the scientific and the academic communities. I accepted that the disciplines of developmental psychology and medicine and public health had sufficiently established that attempts to sublimate one's own inclinations towards sexual attractions or towards gender identity, or to press others to do so, were not only unproductive, but harmful. I observed that official church teaching on these matters, whether from individual bishops or national conferences of bishops or the various offices of the Holy See, almost never engaged the emerging insights and the consensus of the sciences and the social sciences. Now, there was an argument that accommodating LGBTQ requests would diminish heterosexual relationships. But that too was unsubstantiated by any independent or replicable research by the scientific or academic community. And in fact, as the world increasingly did accommodate LGBTQ relationships into the social fabric, no such harm appeared. I also observed problems when same-sex coupling or non-standard gender identities were condemned using, quote, an anthropology or theology of the body, unquote. Those arguments generally began by invoking the creation stories of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 as proof that God intended only two genders, a form of proof texting long abandoned by Catholic exegetes. No reputable scholar employing the historical critical tools embraced by Dei Veritum supports that the authors of the book of Genesis were aware of, much less addressing, matters of non-binary gender when telling the story of Adam and Eve. Other arguments began often with the observation that men and women were physically designed to, quote, fit together in a manner that led to procreation. And then those arguments leapt to critiquing other forms of sexual pleasure or lovemaking that did not lead to the possibility of procreation. For those of us who knew gay and lesbian couples personally, that leap flew in the face of the love that was obviously there. We could see it. Their love was real. Their relationships were real. Their physical expressions of their love were real. And all of it, the love, the relationships, the physical expressions, were as complicated and messy and human as those of heterosexual couples that we knew. For me, firsthand observation undercut moral assertions. And that inner conviction on my part, however, put me outside the present state of official Catholic teaching. Even it put me squarely in the company of many Catholics in the pews. And so, like many priests who cannot assent to one church teaching or another, I chose to keep my thoughts away from the pulpit. I preached on many other subjects, but I never used that platform to question the church's teaching. I did, however, take advantage of working at a university to use the church's academic venues, especially its professional conferences, to think out loud with experts and practitioners about how best to serve our LGBTQ populations in the context of church teaching. And even to think aloud about how church teaching might accommodate this moment of history. I remembered, too long ago to admit, my seminary teaching regarding matters of individual dissent. If you look them up, it's under Norms of Licit Theological Dissent under Human Life in Our Day by the USCCB back in 1968. Those norms for licit theological dissent in the church provided for theologians to critique church teaching, so long as they didn't question the overall authority of the magisterium, as long as they maintained due humility that I myself might be wrong, and that I always presented church teaching fully and fairly. All of that seemed entirely reasonable to me. I was also able to draw on that most traditional of church teachings on, quote, the proper formation of conscience, which I recommend to you, and use that to quietly support others in their faith journeys by teaching them what it meant to create a fully informed conscience as they made their own decisions for their own lives, often complex lives. Thankfully, I was often able to find workarounds that did not challenge church teaching, but which solved the immediate needs of the people in front of me. There was no church teaching that I ever found that forbade the creation of individual use bathrooms. We simply called them family bathrooms at DePaul. We were able to provide health care insurance by extending it, quote, to second adults domiciled in the household, unquote. We were able to host national conferences talking about these subjects at a Catholic university and even offer full courses and degrees at DePaul, which I believe is still the only university offering degrees on this topic, so long and with Cardinal George's consent and permission that we, quote, fully and fairly also taught the Catholic Church's position and the reason for it. Our faculty were protected by the traditions of academic freedom and of tenure, enabling them to teach and preach and research on these matters fully. All that was required for me as president was to remind our critics, and there were many, of the importance of the free flow of ideas, even in a church, and for me to have a bit of a backbone when the critics pushed hard against us using social media tools that we all know too well. To be sure, when Catholic teaching was more than clear, I accepted that I was leading a Catholic organization and I honored the boundaries. Most years, for example, students would ask for free condom distributions in the dorms. We always declined. But we tried to educate students on the difference from having a principled reason for individual condom use and an institution providing them broadly. But more than anything, we tried to respond with kindness whenever that was possible. Most of the requests the students made were easily honored, even if controversial to some. We could honor their choice of pronoun. And that could be done within the ambit of Catholic moral teaching. We hired LGBTQ individuals into senior leadership roles at the university. We made sure that they were in the room when we discussed them and their issues. We made sure their student organizations were funded equally to other student organizations. All of this was done with an awareness on my part that Catholic moral teaching evolves over time, and that there's hardly a moment in church history where some matter of faith or morals was not being debated, or its proponents criticized, or even attacked. One merely has to invoke the name of St. Thomas Aquinas to remember that our arguably greatest Catholic mind was silenced for his edgy teaching, incorporating the insights of Islamic and Greek philosophers into Catholic theology and the philosophy of his day. Many point to the work of St. John Henry Newman on the development of doctrine. I especially like pointing people to John Noonan's book, The Church That Can and Cannot Change, to watch that process as it plays out over the centuries and the church's teaching change. But most recently, I've been pointing people to one of St. Augustine's final books, in which he reviewed the published works of his lifetime, which counted in the hundreds, and realized that his mind had changed on a number of subjects. And so at the end of his life, he wrote a book that is 450 pages or more, that reviews in order every work he ever wrote, and thinks about whether he still believes what was in it. It's entitled The Retractions. And that too is one of our greatest minds in our church. In short, ours is a church that keeps thinking. Our discovery of God's mind and God's intent unfolds as cultures evolve as we learn more scientifically, and as we just think together as a church over time. The church's teaching on LGBTQ matters feels to me as very much a part of that long tradition of sorting through new questions over time and feeling our way toward a position that is consonant with the teaching of Jesus Christ. And so I've had a certain patience with the insanity and the recrimination and, yes, the slow pace and the back and forth of it all. Just within the past few decades, the years in which I've worked for the church, we've seen U.S. bishops encouraging parents to support their LGBTQ children and to encourage society to avoid any form of discrimination. We've seen a pope do the same and even go so far as to support civil marriage for LGBTQ couples, although not sacramental. We've received a new, if cautiously defined, way in which to bless couples in those partnerships and marriages, if not the marriage itself. We've been instructed that LGBTQ individuals may be godparents. We've seen the Pope welcome Sister Jean Gramick to Rome and into his personal embrace for her lifetime of work with the LGBT community after earlier popes and church leaders had pushed back against that. We have seen some national bishops' conferences, notably Australia and New Zealand, issue strongly supportive teaching documents on the inclusion of LGBTQ individuals within the life of the church and its schools. We've seen the official catechism change and incorporate language that acknowledges the presence of gay and lesbian people across centuries and cultures, tacitly accepting that being gay is neither a choice or a sin in itself. And that said, the same catechism suggests that being gay contains within it the temptation towards sin and forbids all sexual expression of that nature. We've seen the Pope broadly caution seminaries from accepting LGBTQ candidates for the priesthood, and at the same time, within a few weeks, send an individual letter encouraging a gay priesthood candidate to remain in formation. The USCCB is presently revising its guidelines for Catholic healthcare, banning gender-affirming treatments or surgeries at our Catholic hospitals. We've seen numerous bishops at our country issue individual teaching documents drawing clear lines about the hiring of LGBTQ faculty, staff, or students at Catholic schools or parishes. But we've seen other bishops stay silent on the matter, and still others issue documents that are more welcoming and inclusive. We've seen 2 Vatican dicasteries issue documents that drew a strong line. The Dicastery of Culture and Education in 2019 assembled a document composed largely of excerpts of former documents, urging Catholic schools to be clear that LGBTQ lifestyles are not consistent with God's intent. The Dicastery for Doctrine just this past April issued Dignitas Infinita, also reinforcing amidst a long list of moral matters that surgical and medical gender-affirming treatments were inconsistent with respect for the dignity of the created human body. And just this summer, the U.S. bishops issued a new pastoral framework for the church's work with youth and young adults, which they define through the age of 39, in which same-sex behavior was still classified as a sin, but characterized as the moral equivalent of heterosexual activity before marriage. That may not be an actual change of church teaching, but it was novel for a bishop's teaching document, and it felt like an ever so slight thawing of past harsher condemnations. Or is it? Time will tell. And that's the point. Bishops, as well as our theologians and Catholic philosophers, are actively writing and thinking about these matters. They have a breadth of opinions. But I think all of them would agree that questions around LGBTQ identity are a vibrant area of church intellectual discourse. Church teaching on LGBTQ matters is a fray at the moment. That's healthy, even as it elicits impatience for some and fear for others. And even as administrators like me have to make decisions before the church has come to one mind on anything. I would actually worry more if there was no energy afoot. Stagnancy in thinking would be a terrible thing. And whatever you call this moment in the church's intellectual reflection on LGBTQ matters, stagnant is hardly a word that comes to mind. It might even be an enjoyable debate if it didn't cause so much pain for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters whose lives deserve to be understood, whose voices deserve to be listened to, and whose judgments on their inner moral lives deserve some crediting by those who quite literally do not know that of which they speak. As the church's fray continues, it's the kindness that's most important and that I recommend to you as your first instinct when you find yourself caught in complex pastoral situations. Whatever your moral starting point, try to steer clear of all the righteous indignation that's swirling in our world. No us versus them, just us, trying to sort this all out with the love and the kindness that Jesus urged for all in his Father's kingdom. There aren't always easy answers to pastoral conundrums. Sometimes you just have to accept that there are matters above your pay grade. But often enough, if you keep your heart alive, if you keep your creativity available for use, and your knowledge of church teaching at a very high level, you can find a way to care for the individuals who are in front of you. So God bless your good hearts, and God bless the ministry that is ahead of you with all its complexities in a very complex and always emerging world. God bless.
Well, I want to thank Father Holtschneider. I think what we've just heard was filled with pastoral wisdom in a long and I'm sure difficult reflection, but I'll claim a privilege to say, as Cardinal Bernardin's biographer, that what we've heard also in the way that it balanced the care that our church calls us to give to every person given to our care, balance that against our desire to be faithful to the church that teaches us how to care for those given to us. That balance you're striking is one I think that gives great credit to your appointment as the Cardinal Joseph Bernardin Fellow. So we're very grateful that you're here with us. Thank you for that. We're grateful also to have two thoughtful speakers to reflect on what we've just heard. Therese Lysaught is no stranger to Catholic Theological Union, a theological ethicist. She's the author of several books. I'll mention just one she co-edited in 2008, The Consistent Ethic of Life, Assessing Its Reception and Relevance with our own Tom Nairn. She's held faculty positions at Marquette and Dayton before coming to Loyola's Institute of Pastoral Studies. She continues her work today in theology, medicine, and bioethics at Loyola's Neiswanger Institute for Bioethics and Healthcare Leadership in the Stritch School of Medicine. Please welcome Professor Therese Lysaught as she offers a few words to reflect on what we've heard.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I am grateful for the invitation for a number of reasons. First, it's always a real pleasure to engage with Father Holtschneider. It's also a pleasure to return to CTU, where I spent at least 3 years working with the Bernardin Center on the Consistent Ethic of Life project that Steve mentioned, that was shepherded by my colleague and your former faculty member, Tom Nairn. Our purpose today is to reflect on how Catholic institutions can become welcoming and inclusive places for LGBTQ people. Father Holtschneider has outlined a series of steps that he took toward that end as he led institutions of Catholic higher education. Doing so required that he navigate a complex landscape of interpersonal convictions, institutional identity, and official church teaching as it has shifted, developed, retrenched, and, well, as he said, who knows what comes next. As an academic theologian, the hat that I was invited to wear today, I would like to translate Father Holtschneider's account into a theological register. For he provides a marvelous exemplar of how theology actually is and ought to be done, as well as its role in helping us navigate our institutions, be they academic, parochial, or healthcare. I will make 3 brief points ending with a parable. First, practice leads theology. Father Holtschneider noted that most of his work around these questions entailed discernment about real, everyday, practical realities, the curriculum, dorms, bathrooms, and so on. It is in these sorts of details where the church lives in the world. One will often hear discernment around such details framed as pastoral. Such claims presume a distinction between doctrine and pastoral application, with the presumption that pastoral means making an exception, accommodation, something that somehow falls short. I would suggest, however, that the distinction between doctrine and pastoral application is false and quite problematic, and at least for 2 reasons. First, doctrine is necessarily embodied in practice. What we do, what we live, is what we believe. If we believe one thing and do another, we're either inconsistent, hypocritical, confused, all of the above, or something worse. The distinction between doctrine and pastoral application wrongly presumes that beliefs are something that exists in our minds, that it's somehow possible to have pure doctrines that are unsullied by the messy realities of the world. That world, by the way, into which the very source of doctrine was incarnated. If you want to know what someone believes, look at what they do and how they live. Second, it fails to recognize that practice is the crucible of doctrine. Or, as I often say, the practice of the church leads theology. Lived practice is the place where the church discovers over time what our doctrines actually are. For example, those of you who have studied historical theology know well that there was no doctrine of the Trinity in the earliest church. There were practices. Jewish Christians saying, God is Lord, which they knew was true. And Jesus is Lord, which they also knew was true, but was really problematic from a Jewish perspective. And eventually baptizing converts in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and trying to figure out how to square all this together. It took centuries and a few somewhat violent Christological controversies, starting with Saul, who was stoning Jewish followers of the way and dragging them to jail, to figure out what our corporate practices were teaching us about who God is. Or, of course, what God was teaching us through these practices. And what emerged was not a victory for either side, but a new and transformative outcome that no one could ever have imagined, which is a sign of how we know that God is at work in it. And so today, this is what Father Holtschneider has described: the ways that the church, via engagement with the LGBTQ people in their midst who are willing to stick with Catholic institutions, are helping the church discern more deeply what God is leading us to understand about God and ourselves, to learn about doctrine. This is why some so vehemently object to welcoming inclusive practices, because it threatens to change doctrine. I'll address that in point 3. 2, theology as interdisciplinary. In order to navigate the complex landscape of leading a Catholic institution, Father Holtschneider had to engage in theological discernment. He didn't just parrot church teaching like an ecclesiastical fundamentalist, nor did he simply follow his feelings like an emotivist. Right? He engaged in a careful process of discernment rooted in study and prayer. The method he employed resonates deeply with the vision for theological method outlined by Pope Francis. We find this vision in two recent documents. Pope Francis's 2023 motu proprio revising the statutes of the Pontifical Academy of Theology, entitled Ad Theologiam Promovendum, and his 2018 Apostolic Constitution, Veritatis Gaudium, which addressed the renewal of ecclesiastical educational institutions like this one. I detail Pope Francis's vision of the work of theology in a recent analysis elsewhere, but to summarize quickly, for him, theology must be 6 things. First, it must be ecclesiological. As he states, a synodal, missionary, and outgoing church can only correspond to an outgoing theology. Ecclesiology and theology fit together. It must be contextual. Theology, he says, must be, quote, a fundamentally contextual theology, capable of reading and interpreting the gospel in the conditions in which men and women live daily in different geographical, social, and cultural environments. It must be synodal. For Pope Francis, as for Father Holtschneider, the heart of theological method involves encounter, listening, and dialogue, especially with those who are different from us in a myriad of ways. Must be transdisciplinary. Quote, given its scientific nature, Pope Francis says, theology must be necessarily engaged in transdisciplinary dialogue with other scientific, philosophical, humanistic, and artistic knowledges. It must integrate love and truth. It's not love or truth, it's love and truth. For Benedict XVI, caritas in veritate. And finally, it must be sacramental. There's an integral relationship between theology and prayer, contemplation, and the sacraments. All of that is what Father Holtschneider describes. So where some would locate theology as the problem, theology is also perhaps the solution. And finally, point 3, I still have time. Theology and the moral law. But Father Holtschneider, we can hear the rejoinder, it's the moral law. So how do we think about the relationship between our theology, church teaching, and our laws, our policies within our institutions, as well as the relationship between church teaching and civil law? This is a very complicated topic. So here, I want to return to what has recently become my favorite parable. I have reflected on it before, as some here know. But since Scripture is the living and active Word of God, every time we turn to it, we can find new meanings. You all know the parable of the man with the withered hand. Mark 3. Jesus enters a synagogue on the Sabbath. There is a man with a withered hand. How did it get that way? We don't know. Some inborn genetic problem? His own fault? Some form of structural violence? An accident? We don't know. Jesus wants to heal him. The religious authorities are horrified. Healing him would violate the most cherished law, the Sabbath. They're not entirely wrong. The Sabbath is foundational. As Abraham Heschel notes, it is the only thing in the creation story that God names as holy. But there's a man who needs healing. Jesus could heal him the next day. But he chooses not to. Does he not care about the Sabbath? Of course he cares about the Sabbath. He's the incarnation of God. He's the one who made it holy in the first place. So it's not that he doesn't care about the law. Rather, he's saying, we've gotten it backwards. We've turned it inside out. People have become secondary to the law, rather than the law existing to serve people, to promote their full flourishing. Once we get it backwards, it becomes an idol. Augustine, esteemed theologian who I hope didn't retract this point I'm going to make, reminds us that in sinning, we don't pursue evils. We pursue good things that God has created. Sin occurs when we pursue a good thing out of order as more important than God and human persons. So this is what's going on in the synagogue. Jesus wants to get the order back in place so that the law serves the flourishing of human persons. So Jesus heals the man. And what do the religious authorities do? They, quote, went out and at once began to plot against him, discussing how to destroy him. Then as now, when law becomes an idol, the result is violence. Either the violence of vitriolic rhetoric, the violence of exclusion, the violence of physical harm to people, or the violence of enacting draconian civil laws. I have much more to say, but I will save that for the Q&A. Peace and all good to you.
Thank you, Professor Lysaught. Just a quick word of reminder to our audience here in the room and those joining us as well online. You're up very shortly. We hope you are thinking about how you would like to join this dialogue. But now it's my happy responsibility to introduce a pastoral leader respected around the Archdiocese of Chicago. And we at CTU also know Father Michael Trail quite well. He's the pastor of our local parish just down 55th Street, St. Thomas the Apostle. And with apologies to the former president of DePaul, here is another speaker with a Loyola connection. Class of '94, by the way. Father Trail graduated from St. Joseph College Seminary at Loyola with a degree in philosophy before continuing his studies at the University of St. Mary of the Lake. Since his appointment to St. Thomas the Apostle in 2021, in my experience, he seems to be everywhere around Hyde Park. I see him all over the place, which is the mark of a great pastor. We're grateful for his ministry here in Hyde Park, and we're grateful we're here with us today. Please welcome Father Michael Trail.
My joy to be with you here this afternoon, and hi to all my neighbors and parishioners. I'll see you on Sunday. So, good. I want to take this opportunity to thank Father Dennis for his words. I can really appreciate where you're coming from in terms of your leadership. I think college is such a formative experience for so many. It's the time where I tell this to the parishioners all the time, where faith no longer becomes the faith of mother and father, but faith becomes one's own. And so thank you to Father Dennis for being really intentional about creating a space where all of God's people can find a faith home in the church. Though my response to you, Father Dennis, is only from the perspective of a parish, because I'm a parish priest. I feel like I'm the least qualified up here. I have an MDiv from Mundelein Seminary, and I've been a priest for 8 years. And so my work over these years has just really been on the ground floor in the life of the parish. In our ecclesial structure, the parish is the most local level of engagement in the life of the church. While other spaces in the Catholic Church and Catholic life can take a more nuanced approach, the parish is a bit of a catch-all. The parish is like, to use a medical example, is like a general practitioner. It has to be a lot of things to a lot of different people. The parish doesn't have the protections of a university, like tenure. It doesn't have the freedom of expression like a conference or some other specialized space in the Catholic world where the question of LGBTQ persons' involvement in the church can only be looked at from a certain angle. The people come to the parish from all walks of life, from every corner of the world, their own experience, their own understanding of who they are, who God has made them to be, and their relationship of themselves into the life of the church. Jesus says, let all the children come to me, and that's in Matthew 19. I take that personally, though, and expand it out of my own mind, where Jesus says, let all of God's people come to me. All of God's people have to find a space within the church. And I really do believe that on the local level, the parish is the space where all of God's people must and can feel welcome. But since the parish has to be a lot of things to a lot of people, therefore it must begin from a place of a pastoral heart that is based in the love of Almighty God through Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit. That is the way and the vehicle by which all of God's people can find a space in the church. And in my mind, the way in which we lead a Catholic organization and with and for LGBTQ persons is to do a couple things. It's through pastoral listening first and foremost. Speaking personally in my own experience in life as a priest, I can't tell you how often people have come to me with their own stories and how often people have shared their life experiences, their joys, their hurts, their sorrows. And while it can be very easy to first and foremost respond with official church teaching or respond to what they are, who they are, or what they may be going through, or any sort of reaction with an official church response, first and foremost, it comes with pastoral listening. Father Dennis, you did that very well in your work with your students at DePaul. But on the local level, at the parish, that work must be continued and actually heightened in a more important way. The second thing where this gets accomplished by leading a Catholic organization with and for LGBTQ persons is through pastoral preaching. Father Dennis, you got the easy cop-out of not being able to preach about it and not having to preach about it. But again, the space in church is the application of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the daily life of the people of God. And so therefore, the topics of life must be addressed. Moral issues, justice issues, the many issues that people come with as they lay their all on the altar and as they give all those things that burden them to the Lord and all the joys that they come with to thank God for. We as the church and as the parish and as pastoral ministers must use preaching as a way to address and create a space where LGBTQ persons can and should feel welcome within the church. Now, what does that mean for us, though, and how do we practically and do that in an applicable way? In my mind, that means being really intentional around language. One of the things that I've tried to do at St. Thomas the Apostle and everywhere that I get an opportunity to preach is to use language that's inclusive of all. In addition to using traditional language around marriage and also being around, husband and wife in the sacrament of marriage, it's also using inclusive language like life partner, companion. And so creating opening and widening up our net in terms of our preaching so that as the listener of the homily is hearing the word of God expounded and expanded upon, that there is a space created for them. And so using language like life partner, companion, and even using generic words like husband and wife, but in a way so that is inclusive of LGBTQ persons, it allows the gospel to become more and more applicable to them, and so that they can see how the gospel has an effect and has space and place in their life. Father Dennis, you talked about pastoral acknowledgement in terms of like the struggle of asking the question of, do we create space with our alumni association to honor marriages and to honor these great moments in the life of LGBTQ persons? And I would say that it's absolutely true. On the parish side, though, it's about creating a space where the life of all of God's people, LGBTQ persons included, and families are celebrated. At St. Thomas, what we do is we do public baptisms once a month at the 10 o'clock mass. Some of my parishioners hate it because mass goes an hour and 15 minutes, but that's okay, But a couple of weeks ago, we had a baptism of a beautiful little baby girl with two mothers, and it just being a space where it was normalized. It was the first Sunday of the month, and that's the thing that we do on the first Sunday of the month. We didn't relegate this couple to the private baptism on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday at 6:30 at night, but just incorporating the LGBTQ community into the regular life of our parish and not being weird about it or being extraordinary or waving or doing something that says, oh, look at what we've done. But all of God's people are all of God's people, and the sacraments are the sacraments. And so creating an equal opportunity space for that to be celebrated and for it to be normalized and for it to just be regular. It's also acknowledging the lived experiences as well. One of the beautiful things I get to do as pastor, and thank you, Steve, for calling me out and for being in the neighborhoods. Make sure you say hi next time. Is the work that I get to do as a priest is to do pastoral visits to families, going to homes. I've been to more wedding receptions than I care to admit. All those different great moments in the life of a parish, and particularly in my life as a priest. And creating a space and leading a space where LGBTQ persons feel welcome and seen and heard is extending that pastoral invitation to the community as well to say, let me go to your home. And just as we do that with other couples and we visit the sick and the shut and everything else, it's just a normal part. It becomes a normal part and place of parish life. And so in my mind, leading a space where LGBTQ persons are seen and heard is to normalize our pastoral response and equalize our pastoral response in the way in which we, for me, particularly as a priest and for us as pastoral ministers, include this community into the life of our parish. Because at the end of the day, the parish finds itself in this odd spot, does it not? It finds itself as being part of the larger church structure, but also to being very mindful of the lived experience of the people that walk through its doors each and every single week. Our job as parish, though, is to create that space where all of God's people feel welcome. At the end of the day, I find myself as the thing that comes to mind is just find the loophole, if you will. You know, we have to know what our Catholic doctrine is. We have to know what our Catholic teaching is. We have to, and particularly for me as a priest, you know, we have to take the mandatum of, you know, we have to profess everything that what we believe in the Catholic Church and all that it professes, even if it's made in error. But regardless, though, for us as a pastoral ministers, creating a space where LGBTQ persons can feel at home and be in leadership and to have a seat at the table is to know what we believe and profess, but that also to see how can this community and how can our community, because to say it's this community means to put it at an arm's length, but say how can we say that our community, all of God's people, the parishioners, the parish, how can we create not a workaround, but a space where all of God's people can feel welcome. And so then today, I really just look at the very real practical level. I can really appreciate Father Dennis's approach, looking at it from an administrative level and from a higher level, being able to make those concrete decisions and those concrete actionable items. But our job at a parish is to continue the work that he has done on the university or in a particularly specialized field, even a space like CTU being a specialized field, but then also to making it into a general practical space where all of God's people will feel welcome. And I pray that we hope to do that at St. Thomas the Apostle as best we can. And we walk with those who may not completely understand, but it's the daily work of making sure that all of God's people can come to have a relationship with the Lord. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Father Trail. Let me first invite our panel to abandon the safety and shelter of your private table and assume a place of more elevated visibility here for the next part. And while I do that, let me also say to the room here with us, I'm going to focus my attention on the questions in the room in just a moment, conscious as I am of the time. But I'll just lead very quickly with a question that came from online. We had a question come, can anyone recommend a couple of books that folks might look at for additional guidance along these same lines?
I got to pull up my phone. Give me a minute here. I got a whole list.
I left my phone at the table.
So I mentioned this in passing, but I'm going to repeat it because I just think it's an incredibly helpful work. Justice John Noonan wrote a book a number of years ago that was not on LGBTQ teaching per se, but he was responding to what he had always heard that Catholic teaching doesn't change. And he said, well, actually, if you look at it, it does. And then he showed us how teaching on slavery changed over almost 400 years. He talked about how marriage law has changed, how the church's condemnation of the use of interest by banks has changed. And he just went one after another and talked about how that happened. It was almost always a messy and painful and lengthy process with back and forths and deeply, deeply culturally rooted. And he just kind of shows how the church does actually grow in its appreciation on what's really leads to human flourishing and something that reflects the mind of Jesus in creating the kingdom that he spoke of often in his speech. So I just encourage you, not so much on the specific topic here, but to educate yourselves on how the church's mind develops over time on issues. It'll give you patience even as it gives you hope.
I know naturally, of course, when the minute I'm looking something up, I can't find it, as is always the case. But the things that kind of come to mind for me particularly is that obviously just the classics of just, Father James Martin, building a bridge. It's the, Michael Laughlin's book, Hidden Mercy, where it looks at it from a historical perspective, this topic from a historical perspective. There's an Episcopalian priest out of England, and his name escapes me. He's the author, but
James Ellison.
No, his name is African priest. He is the title of the book is Gay Black Queer Christian, and so looking at the theology of queerness in the life and the lens of the church. So those are the few things that kind of come off to mind immediately. So being able to look at it from both a pastoral perspective, but also a theological perspective as well.
Right, and I would also say, you mentioned Michael Laughlin's Hidden Mercies, for which there is a podcast, free version, which is also really great to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the important and beautiful things about that story is he narrates how Catholics, people of faith, practiced in a context 40 years ago when official teaching had not actually started to change often, or shift or whatever it's doing now. And so looking at the witness of their lives, for which they were also quite marginalized, right? For which they suffered the social cost rather than trying to put it on other people, which is what some of our current strategies seem to do, right? And I think that's a really important window into, even the current moment.
I want to invite questions from the room and privilege. We have some questions that have come from online, but privilege questions in the room because this School of Theology and Ministry is a place where we do train students to go out and deal with these questions on the ground. Your questions in that light are the most important questions here, I think, though we want to hear all of them. Do we have any questions here in the room that we might pose to the panel, or thoughts, reflections for that matter?
In the Archdiocese of Chicago, there is an organization called AGLOW, which was an initial response to minister with the LGBTQ community. What has been happening more recently, though, is that members of the community are choosing to stay within their parishes. They don't want to just come together on a Sunday and be part of a special group. They wish to be part of their communities. So my question to you would be, how do you see that trend occurring, and how do you think churches that may have some hesitancy from their pastors in addressing that, even though I myself, being a person who works for the church, knows that it is an issue and possibly supported by the majority of the parishioners?
So I say mass for AGLOW once a month, and before I became pastor at St. Thomas the Apostle, I was associate pastor at Our Lady of Mount Carmel on Belmont Avenue in the Boys Town neighborhood, where AGLOW is housed, and they've just celebrated their 36th anniversary of ministry in the Archdiocese, founded by Cardinal Bernardin. I think it's a both and. I think it's a both and. One, in the sense of there's a real beauty about AGLOW. It's a besides being pastor, it's a ministry it's a ministry in a community that I love really much, because there's an intentionality there, and there's a space where there's a specific space where a section of God's people can come together in a very intentional way. But during my time as associate at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, but even here at St. Thomas the Apostle, just the integration of the LGBTQ community in the life of the parish, in the regular life of the parish, I think is first and foremost a good showing of our movement forward theologically, but also pastorally. But I think there's a space for both end. It's about individuals, about finding a community in their local, perhaps on their local parish level, where they do feel that they can bring their full authentic selves into the life of the parish, and there's no issue or no strife or no difficulty. But as we know, it's a big church and it's a very, very large tent, and depending on locations and the mood of the moodiness of the pastor, it can create a space of hostility. And so I think there's also a space for a place like a Globe, because then if a parishioner or a couple or a family doesn't feel at home or welcome or seen or validated in their local parish community, there's an intentional space where they can go. Aglow has been around, like I said, for 36 years, and thanks be to God, actually it's becoming an older population because more and more of the LGBTQ community is filtering into the daily life of the parish. I think that's great. But I think there's something nice about having just an intentional space as well, and then making room for both.
I had a conversation with Art Johnston one day. You may not know him. Art Johnston was the founder of the Sidetrack, which is one of the kind of leading LGBTQ bars in the area. I knew him from the Chicago History Museum, where I was on the board. And Art was one of 4 people who led the city charge to deal with AIDS back in the day. And then he was one of the folks who led the charge in Illinois to get gay marriage recognized by the state. And so he's just a thoughtful, interesting guy, because he's been at all these different moments of gay history as not just a witness, but kind of a leader in it. And I asked him one day about the bar he was running. And he told me that the gay bars were going out of fashion as people moved out of neighborhoods and moved within their local communities, and it just became more normalized, and that there was less of a need. And then he said, but then that turned, and as people went into the larger communities and didn't live in the hood anymore, that they needed a place to come back to where people did understand their lives and they could find comfort in the support of each other. And my guess is the answer is just as you noted from your own experience, it's going to be a bit of both. People are going to need the support of each other in communities where their children see people like their parents. And it's going to be nice to be fully included in the world's parishes and organizations. So I don't see one or the other as the clear future.
Yeah, and another piece of that too is that, as many of you know, one can have a vibrant parish in all kinds of different ways, and then leadership changes, right? And leadership, it really is one of the central issues and questions here, right? And how leaders of our various institutions, and we have lots of different kinds of institutions, right? Parishes, educational institutions, healthcare institutions, they're all different. But leadership is crucial. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about Father Holtschneider's talk, I'm going to throw in now because I didn't get it in my 10 minutes, was we heard words that we don't normally hear, right? We heard kindness, humility, creativity. He didn't say prudence, but he demonstrated prudence. There was another one, I forget. Right, we heard this language of virtue, right? Now, a lot of times for folks who are not inclusive, virtue is up front. But the virtue that's up front is my righteousness over your sin, right? And in the virtue tradition, Aquinas, I liked how you put your hand on your heart when you talked about Aquinas. Aquinas and Aristotle, the main focus of virtue conversation is us, right? My virtue. What's going on with my virtue, right? I might be really virtuous in some area, but I know for a fact that I'm like really bad in all these other ones, right? So my main focus should be on my virtue, the unity thereof all the time, right? And it's a wide complex of virtues. The intellectual virtues, we don't see that in a lot of theology. The moral virtues, the theological virtues, the infused cardinal virtues, when like charity transforms all the prudential cardinal virtues, and the fruits of the Holy Spirit, peace, joy, gentleness, right? These are the marks of the presence of the Holy Spirit. And if those are not there, that means the Holy Spirit isn't there. And if the Holy Spirit isn't there, the truth isn't there, because the truth is Jesus and we are a Trinitarian people, right? So Father Holtschneider's lifting up of the virtues is a real crucial component of this conversation about how we think about theology, how we think about pastoral leadership, how we think about institutional leadership, and how we think about our own discipleship.
Another question here in the room. I'm going to say really quickly, we do have questions piling up online. I'm aware of them. The recording, by the way, will be made available in probably a couple of weeks' time. But let's go to a question here in the room. I want to privilege the students if I can.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for this conversation. I hate to be the person who's like, I have a comment. I have a comment and a question. I know there was a mention of Michael Laughlin's book, Hidden Mercy, and its discussion about LGBTQ people, LGBTQ Catholics and the church in the 80s. And, you know, to me, it seems like a lot of what was recorded in that book was possible, being that this is in the decades after Vatican II, right? So like there was stuff changing in the church, like there was this kind of, different sort of like pastoral energy in the church. And also the 80s is the time of the AIDS crisis, right? And I think that's really relevant to the book as well. Like the podcast that became before that book was called Plague, right? About the AIDS crisis. But the reason that I'm bringing that up is that in the midst of that time was published what's referred to as the Halloween letter, I think by Ratzinger, about I can't remember the official title, but it was about something about addressing homosexual persons, right? And then this was a lot of like rolling back of, or an attempt to roll back of, you know, how some Catholic churches were connecting pastorally with LGBTQ people. At the Outreach Conference a couple years ago, I heard Marianne Burke speak, the executive director of Dignity USA. And she was sort of putting forth this idea that during that time, it was groups of Catholic lay people, even groups of Catholic people outside the church, you know, Dignity is an organization outside of the church, that was, you know, continuing to show what this could look like, right? How could the church and LGBTQ people coexist? How can LGBTQ people be in the church? How can we be with one another, care for one another? You know, and just that sort of like brought to mind to me, where are we seeing LGBTQ leadership in the church now? And how can we continue to foster that leadership?
I'm going to add to what you say and not change a single word of it. And it's this: I can get on a stump speech on another whole area that of someday feminist history will be rewritten to incorporate nuns. They are absolutely absent from women's history right now, but you cannot tell the history of literacy in the United States without the westward expansion and the foundation of schools at every stop for boys and girls. You can't talk about the rise of healthcare in this country without women religious building these incredible health systems of national stature. But in truth, they have a role to play in this story too. At universities, as an example, but not only at universities, 2/3 were founded by women of the Catholic University. You may know that. And much of the work for reaching out to the LGBTQ community started there very quietly. They started making possible homes for them, scholarships for them, supports for them, in whatever was needed, in ways that permission was not sought. It was simply done. And it's yet another high point that is not told in this story. That is a kind of an honor to the good heart of women who've given their lives to this church and frankly built this church, and whose stories are not yet fully told. So I'm just adding that to what you're saying.
And this is, I don't actually have the data on this, so this is my ad hoc impression about history. But my ad hoc impression is that those people who faithfully stand up, try to do the work, do the theology, and who are silenced or somehow pushed back, right? So you mentioned Janine Gramick, right? Did the work, really got whacked. Right? Eve Congar, forget about Dave Lubach if he was like silenced or not. But there does seem to be a history that for people like that who get, what's the word I want? Chastised by the church and who accept it. Gene Gramick didn't stop, but right. Eventually they win. And you know who doesn't win? People like Vigano, right? People who position themselves, who have some slight, and then go on the attack, right? Now that might not be comforting in the short term, but we are an eschatological people.
Hey, everybody. My career was in public education at the high school level. And so these questions even were very central to public education in the last decade or so. And so I think this is half a comment, maybe just a inviting comment, which is, I think some of the things we had to challenge ourselves to do or were pushed by young people to do was to reconsider our gendered universe, the way we had organized ourselves in gender, and not always in a purposeful way. So we had to ask ourselves, why are we gendering fill in the blank? Does it need to be gendered? Could we break that out? Because then you're opening to bring it back to Father Trail, we're then just breaking down barriers we didn't even intend to put into place when we gender. And in high school, traditionally, so much is gendered, it's crazy. So we started to break that down. And I think that we had to push ourselves to check our assumptions about why we had the practices we had. And this was gender and a lot of other topics, but just to say, is there some way we're doing a thing that is unintentionally excluding? And where we can take those limits out, we should just do it. Because there may be other people we're excluding and we don't even know it. So I think the initials kind of move into gender and not just sexuality. And so I think that's something as a public educator, I really found us challenged to do because, and really truly, it was the kids saying, what are you doing? Because we don't see gender the way you saw gender.
Well, and another point on my sheet that I wasn't able to make. Right, so in the world of ethics, what do we love to do? We love to pose dilemmas, quandaries, either ors, right? You got to pick, kill the patient or not kill the patient, right? It's always one or the other, right? If you do ethics right, the job of ethics is to imagine different options, right? So you came up with, what a concept, family bathrooms. Not in the playbook, right? But that's the work of faithful, normal, intelligent, creative. Creativity has to be part of this. And part of it comes from questioning your assumptions. Like, we just inherited this. Where did this come from? We don't actually need to do it that way. And you know, how do we build these spaces that are just configured differently for everybody? And then that can solve a lot of other issues without having to take them head on.
The other piece that comes to mind for me too is, and this is certainly for those of you who are on the higher theological level in terms of like the university and the graduate and postgraduate work, is not being able to explore other theological avenues by which we look at the human person, right? Because as of right now, what's our standard bearer is theology of the body and Aquinas's understanding of the human person and marriage, and that becomes like the basis by which we do a lot of things. But there are lots of other theological frameworks and viewpoints that we can authentically grab from within our Catholic tradition, which can help challenge and answer some of those questions and think about those things in a different kind of way. We have the space for it. It's just in our traditional seminaries, in our what seem to be the largest voices tend to be those things that continue to create that box that don't make room for a theological exploration of the human person in a different kind of way that's so well within our tradition. The trouble, though, is that on the local level, we frankly just don't have the space or the avenues to be able to do that. The responsibility then works on the schools of theology, the seminaries, and other people who work in theological areas to be able to explore that and make it more accessible to the parish and to those of us in pastoral ministry.
I think it just, I'm going to ask my own question. Like a really important difference that hasn't really been lifted up yet, but is kind of crucial for this conversation, is that Father Trail's context is different than our context. Why? Because at least in theory, everybody in your organization is Catholic.
True.
Right? And more for universities, it's not even 50% Catholic. Faculty, staff, students, healthcare, for sure, right? If you have 10% Catholics in your population anywhere, like, you're doing great. And that makes a real difference, right? I mean, what does it mean to minister to people who aren't Catholic around these issues? How do you navigate Catholic identity as an institution? It plays one way in a Catholic parish and a different way in other Catholic institutions.
I'm gonna we've got a whole bunch of questions in the chat, and I'm just gonna ask one last one, being conscious of time here, and I'm going to direct it at our main speaker, Father Holtschneider, and let you have the last word on this question if I can. With gratitude to everyone who wrote in, we're trying to be very conscious of time here and do a lot of things. But the question is, when creating affirming spaces for LGBTQ plus individuals, there's sometimes pushback from some corners of the community. For example, a constituent who consistently misgenders other constituents. What suggestions do you have to help continue fostering positive change in these situations?
A few. We obviously we're not starting from the same place, and people really do feel very strongly that they've got to sometimes protect the church from changing in ways that they think would really harm the church they know and love, and they see it that strongly, and they become the kind of self-appointed sometimes, even in the way that they can go about it, but it can be painful for those who are on the receiving end of it, and I think leaders have to do a number of things. Number one, the way that you speak in public, as in some of the language you chose when you were giving your comments, the way that the leader refers to people or doesn't, acknowledges people's presence or doesn't, and not just with LGBT populations, but with any populations that aren't always included in our majorities. The degree to which the leader, her himself, puts that out there is incredibly tone setting for an organization and sends a message. In addition, there were times I had to speak about it very directly. And so I talked about the importance of kindness in the organization. That in the end, we have to be characterized that by kindness. We can have disagreements. We can fight like cats and dogs at a university. It's expected. You hire an organization of independent thinkers, that's what you get. But we can do it with kindness, and to call people to that, or any particular religious tradition that that organization specifically holds to. If it's Franciscan, if it's Jesuit, if it's Sisters of Mercy, to call upon the idea of mercy in our discourse, to call people to how we go about engaging this, I think actually needs to be said from time to time. So exemplified, but also said. And there's probably a bunch of others, but those first two, I think, are key for a leader in an organization.
Well, we want to really thank our panel. In fact, let's thank our panel, please. This is obviously a conversation that goes on, and our fondest hope in having this conversation today is that it's food for thought for the students who will enter into pastoral ministry, for the students who will go on to all sorts of other ministries in the church as well, and in fact, for Catholic and other people of goodwill who are within the sound of our voice. As I say, the recording of this event will be made available. We're very happy to be able to do it. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that this event doesn't happen without a number of people. I'll mention particularly Yolanda Corsage-Montilla, Marty Fitzgerald and Paul Shackelford, Angela Lachey, and Peter Cunningham. And if I've forgotten anyone, kindly forgive me. I'll also add that the event never happens without an audience. Thank all of you for joining us for these thought-provoking and challenging but altogether necessary prompts to think about what maybe we're not thinking about enough. So let us leave on that note, resolved to think a little bit more about who we are not thinking about, and to be careful at all times in our ministry and in our spaces to remember kindness, love for the other, mercy. These are the things that mark our faith, our ministry, who we are. Thank you, Father Holtschneider. Welcome to CTU. Thank you, Father Trail. Thank you, Professor Lysaught. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.